Good morning and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Portrayal of the Arctic Indigenous Peoples in Mainstream Culture, Accuracy or Cliché. Today, our distinct speakers will be discussing which stereotypes regarding the Arctic Indigenous Peoples still prevail in the mainstream culture, their roots, and if there are any instruments which might be implemented to solve those stereotypes. My name is Andrei Gladi, and I'm a project manager at the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Whitney Luckenbauer, who is a professor at the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. Whitney will introduce our speakers and will moderate the session. And please let us know where you come from in the chat box, and you are all welcome to put your questions into the chat box as well. Our panelists will be answering those questions after the discussion part of this session. I wish to all of us a fruitful discussion, and Whitney, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Dr. Gladi, and thanks to the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network for organizing this webinar, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining from several countries. I live in Oxford County in Ontario, Canada, on traditional Anishinaabe and neutral territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. And by taking the time to acknowledge the land that I stand on, I remind myself of the long history of silencing in this country and around the circumpolar world, and the need to speak our truths on a journey towards reconciliation. So we have a really distinguished group of panelists who will be sharing their expertise and insights with us today. To introduce them all briefly in turn, and these are really short introductions because these are truly interesting people with incredible diverse experiences and really, really rich backgrounds and expertise. Dr. Halihana Alagam Ayaga Stepatin is an artist, activist, and assistant professor of Arctic Security Studies at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies in Anchorage, and she is Unanga from the Aleutian Islands. She is a U.S. Navy veteran, and her scholarly research theorizes Unanga subsistence cosmologies rooted from her upbringing. So welcome, Halihana. We have Dr. Dirk Gint, who is a professor of theater studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where his work attends to post-war and contemporary queer theater and performance from an international perspective. And he's taught many courses in theater history, performativity, performance theory, theater activism, cultural representations, fashion theory, intercultural theory, as well as gender and queer studies. So Dirk, really look forward to your contributions and insights. Our next speaker will be Dr. Kopeli Kuk, who's a professor in Sami Studies and Digital Humanities at Umeå University and is deputy director of the Swedish National Research Infrastructure Humanfra. Really interesting project, Kopeli, that I'd not heard of before, that compiles and links to digital and e-scientific data sets, tools, expertise, educational opportunities to make these identifiable, accessible, and she conducts research within the focus areas of digital practice and is interested in cultural forms of expression, storytelling, and as well as critical studies in minority indigenous research. Hence, you're certainly welcome contributions to this panel. We also have my dear friend Bridget Larocque, who's an Indigenous Métis scholar of the Northwest Territories based in Yellowknife. I'm very privileged to work closely with her in her capacity as the co-lead of the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network that we both serve. And she also acts as our esteemed chair of our Northern Advisory Board. She has a profound knowledge, not only of her home region, but of the entire circumpolar world, brings a comprehensive knowledge of research methods and Indigenous and gender issues, and she's a recent graduate of the One Health Master's Program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and recently co-hosted a groundbreaking workshop on gender and Arctic security. So welcome, Bridget. Welcome as well to Kimberly Fairman, who's Executive Director of the Institute for Circumpolar Health Research, which follows her very distinguished career in the federal public service. Kimberly, I remember you telling me you're originally a nurse, trained as a nurse at Aurora College in the Northwest Territories, and she continues to work with researchers, Indigenous knowledge holders, clinicians, and policymakers in health systems and how this impacts on the Northern patient's experience. And her work is really incredible in how it showcases the valuable contributions of Northern communities, practitioners, and Indigenous knowledge holders to the modern research agenda. She also resides in Yellowknife and is joining us from there today. And last but not least, we have Dr. Evgenia Jen Sidorova, who is a research and data analyst at the University of Calgary and also with Puktutit, Inuit Women of Canada. And she is an Indigenous Siberian, a Sakha scholar from Yakutsk in the Sakha Republic. And her areas of expertise include the incorporation of Indigenous and local knowledge in wildlife management, science, and industrial development. And she's also really helped to reimagine and change the scope of how we're looking at Arctic security and imagining what that means for diverse Northern Indigenous peoples. So we have a series of questions, sort of clusters of 3 questions. So I think to begin with, the first question to ponder, what are the main stereotypes and cliches about Indigenous peoples of the Arctic in circulation, in news media, social media, mainstream media? And to what extent are these harmful to Indigenous people? And perhaps as an adjacent question, do you see any major patterns or trends in how Indigenous peoples' cultures and ways of knowing, living, learning, and being are oversimplified in the media? So perhaps just going, not to put anybody on the spot, but perhaps if I can start with you, Dr. Seppetin, your initial thoughts on stereotypes, cliches, and then their implications.
Yes, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Indigenous peoples, to me, when I think about the Arctic and in my research, we're just not present, especially when we consider climate change, right? In mass media, when people Google climate change or think about climate change, it's always the polar bears are getting skinny, sea ice is melting, and it has nothing to do with Indigenous peoples. But of course, we include those images in what we think of as the Arctic as well. But for us, it's about the human experience of the Arctic. It's about the Indigenous experience of the Arctic, especially considering how the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world, which is felt disproportionately by Indigenous peoples of the circumpolar Arctic. So when I think of the ways that we're portrayed in mass media, we're really oversimplified. And whereas people, if Indigenous peoples are included in this representation of what the Arctic is, we're just like doing arts and crafts. We're just, quote, primitive, right? And not involved in decision-making priorities. And this is from a mass media perspective. From my perspective as a Nunavut person born and raised in my homelands, it's very different, right? I see myself and our people as making decisions about what happens in our places, especially in Nunangam Tunangan in the Aleutian Islands, where we're a little bit more geographically distant and harder to get to. We're not on the road system, right? So we have a little bit more autonomy in determining who and what gets to represent or come to Nungam Tunangan and on what terms, on our terms. So it's different across the Arctic, and especially in the North American Arctic, where infrastructure is a big inaccessibility compared to the European Arctic, right? So like, we don't have roads, we don't have internet. I probably couldn't have this conversation if I was in my village right now. And so this portrayal of Indigenous peoples as just like arts and craftsy is a big disservice, though, through the media. Of course, it completely disregards the fact that we have scientific knowledge, that we've always been here, and we are the ones that have, adapted to change, to people, to colonialism, to all of these things and all of these invasions from the outside. And we're still here, right? We're still adapting. And if we look to Indigenous peoples and our methodologies, our ways of knowing, our ways of being, then I think we can all move forward in a collective, towards collective climate solutions that are representative of what we want and what we need, because we're the ones feeling it. And that's all I have to say for
now. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Gint.
Yeah, so it's this issue of lack of representation and ignorance that I would like to bounce off on here, if it's okay. And Just a small detail. I'm not a professor at Concordia University, but I'm a professor at Stockholm University. So I'm based in Sweden, which of course requires a different form of positionality here. Having said that, I also would like to acknowledge that I'm currently a guest at the University of Ottawa, and I want to acknowledge that the land and territory upon which I find myself today is traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, who have been the custodians of this land since times immemorial. But then in terms of my positionality, I come to the table in a very humble way as a settler theatre scholar who is doing research in close dialogue and conversation with Giron Sami Theater, which is a Sami indigenous ensemble in the very north of Sweden, in the city of Kiruna, Giron, that also happens to be the home of the largest active iron ore mine in Europe. So you can imagine there's a lot of struggle around territories. There's a lot of protests against the industrial exploitation by the mining industry, but also by the forestry and hydroelectric industry. Now, apart from these issues around, these very real issues around land and resources, which the theatre brings up in a lot of their productions, another concrete problem they're facing is what the feminist political sciences scholar Rauno Kuokkanen calls epistemic ignorance. Like, to put it briefly, Swedes know very little to nothing about the Sami people. Swedes know very little to nothing about Nordic settler colonialism. I'll just give you an idea and also give the artistic director of Giron Sami Teater a voice here, Åsa Simma, which you see on the slide here, laments this fact that she constantly has to explain and educate people. So this is a quote from an interview. When I think about how many Swedes I've educated about the Sami, I get quite tired. I think this is the task of the National Education Agency, not mine. Why should I have to explain that you shouldn't say the L word? Why you should say Sami? That's why I've made a turn now to stimulate our own artists' own expertise to be able to independently stage a production. So the issue that is at stake here to also combat ignorance and representation by or false representations by majoritarian society is to create an ensemble that will tell indigenous stories on indigenous terms also. And I would like to quickly give you an example of a production that Giron Sami Teater did a few years ago, which was called Colonial Nation. It was directed by Skål Sami director Paulina Feodorov, and it was a collective and multilingual documentary theatre project that assembled anonymized oral histories and witness testimonies from all over Sapmi to explore the manifold legacies of settler colonialism in Northern Europe. And a key impulse for this project was the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, as hinted at in the intriguing spelling of Colonial Nation, the production confronted multiple intersecting issues, including the negative effects of the national borders that continue to divide Sapmi, and it's Sweden, Russia, Norway, and Finland that have divided this territory, this people. The struggle for self-determination, but also the impact of global climate change on the living conditions in the Arctic, as we've already heard in the previous presentation. But an equally prominent dimension of Colonial Nation was the celebration of indigenous resistance and agency, the demand to tell one's own story on one's own terms, and the desire to give a colonized people a voice, a people whose stories, experiences, and identities are often manipulated, commercialized, or silenced. And the production set its own terms for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a very strategic way within the first 5 minutes, when one of the actors, Elina Israelsson, stepped forward to address non-Sami audiences in Swedish and to welcome them into this performance space. So Colonial Nation was offered as a gift, but accepting this gift also meant honoring the responsibilities that come with it. So Israelsson asked non-Sami audiences to maintain a respectful distance and realize that catering to them was not a primary concern of the production. I would just like to quote from this opening monologue here. Colonization is not a shared experience between the one who is colonizing and the one who is subjected to it. We have two entirely different roles in this history. We are talking about our shared experience as a people, as a Sami. And you are welcome to share our shared experience with us, to witness. And maybe this can become a shared experience, the fact that we are witnessing. So from the very start, the cast here highlighted its own indigenous perspective, but also highlighted critical reflection on positionality, on privilege, and also importantly rescued colonial nations from being consumed by an ever so voracious colonial gaze that just wants a spectacle of victimhood. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Much to reflect upon. Already talking about oversimplification, also overlooked, and issues even there around fatigue of having to correct misconceptions, misinformation, ignorance, but then also this call to witness and forging potentially some shared spaces. Lots of really, I think, powerful things to think about. Dr. Kok, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I guess I'll continue, and since I'm also talking from for the Sápmi area, I'm currently in Umeå in northern Sweden. So I really thank you that they could make this introduction and introduce you to that situation in Sápmi. And I totally agree with what you said, and also what Hanna said. In other indigenous contexts, there's a lack of knowledge about culture and history, and also about contemporary everyday life or Sami society in general in the Nordic countries. I think we have a colleague in the chat saying that the situation is quite similar in Finland, and I've also observed that. There is a great hereditary, that's hard word, sorry, heterogeneity in Sápmi, since we're talking of 4 different countries, 9 to 10 languages, various livelihoods, and minority politics that have affected the Sami strongly, with periods of assimilation, segregation, resulting in stigmatization, language loss, and so on. We've had European and international conventions that put pressure on the national states and contributed to a shift to better, for instance, about language rights. But still, there are a lot of issues to vividly debated and to be solved when it comes to land rights and man and exploitations on reindeer herding, grazing areas, discrimination against the Sami population, for instance. So I think that the stereotypes we find that the representation of Sami culture are being something from former times, as a kind of historical representation of what life used to be, and just asking on Google about Sápmi or Sami population, you got something from the archives, or you got colorful picture of people in traditional clothes in a wintry landscape, which is definitely not the picture of everyday life in Sápmi. There is also an over-representation of reindeer herding, male conducting reindeer herding in mountain, and always in winter on pictures for strange reasons. So that's something that mainstream culture and media and popular culture and also educational materials actually maintain this misrepresentation, because there is actually a minority of Sami population are reindeer herders, even if it's true that reindeer herding is an important part of Sami culture, also in heritage. And there are women involved in reindeer herding, for instance, and there is a variety of traditional ways of life and actually a broad range of professions across the Nordic countries. So that's totally in line with what has been said previously. Something I want to add to the discussion is also, I think, the lack of knowledge about the situation for the Sami languages, which is reflected in different attitudes and assumptions. So the language are often described as endangered and dying. And I think what's important to see is also that there is actually a lot of efforts and initiative doing for revitalizing the languages, different generations, and there's a lot happening there also from the initiative of organizations, institutions, but also community members and outside institutional structures. So I think it's a misrepresentation to talk about dying language where there is so much efforts put in revitalization efforts, even if the situation is quite severe for many of the Sami languages. But there is a pride and a tremendous effort for maintaining the languages. And I think that's the stereotypes also that's a threat to the regions, this misrepresentation of kind of monolingual societies. And in the past, there's been a fear of minority languages being a threat or an obstacle to learn the national languages. So like if you were a Sami speaker, you wouldn't be able to learn properly Norwegian, Sami, Finnish, and so on. So it's less tangible in relation to national minorities, but the same ideology still exists when it comes to minority groups today. And I think it's in the representations we see today, there is still this legacy from past time and past ideologies. I think this lack of knowledge and also lack of visibility of Sami culture and cultural heritage and the presence in general in media and popular culture in particular, that has also severe consequences, because misrepresentations lead also to racism and sometimes also to policies, decisions, or national strategies that are based on wrong assumptions or that neglect indigenous populations. I think the misrepresentation of languages also create an obstacle in the form of language barriers for learners of heritage languages, an obstacle for majority society regarding possibilities to learn or even interest to know more about, for instance, Sami languages. And I think there is much more to say there about the consequences of this misrepresentation, but I stop there because I want also to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think we'll come back to this theme of roots and implications and how those are also tied into broader colonial projects and certainly what's going on in the Sapmi and the nature of this of respective states not being respectful and assigning who gets to be a Sami for these central purposes. I think Evgenia may speak to this, Jen may speak to this as well, in light of her deep understanding of the Russian space for indigenous peoples as well. For now, Ms. Larocque.
Geez, Whitney, I was hoping Kimberly went before me. I think, the cliche is that, indigenous peoples are all one people and that it's a collective. And if we, make policy for one, we could make policy for everyone. So pardon the noise in the background. I'm in Quebec City and there's construction just outside the hotel. But the biggest concern, especially from a Canadian perspective, is that there's an erasure of three distinct peoples, regardless of political clout per se or connection to the political party of the day. But there's so many stereotypes and they come, historically that, indigenous peoples, are specifically First Nations, treaty making with First Nations peoples, that they were childlike, that they're to be mere subjects of the crown, that they're, the queen's children or the king's children, and really diminishing their culture, their strength, their resilience, their adaptability, their ability to read the land and to work with their animals and protect their environment. The concern as well is that their knowledge is not on par with academic institutions. So we have to really be cautious of that, because when we talk about traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, then it gets minimized, or it's a secondary thought to the academic mainstream Western knowledge system. Then we have concern with because of climate change and our environment changing, then there's an erasure of our traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. We then also have to challenge local knowledge, because all of a sudden settlers are claiming, wow, they were here since, the 1800s and their voices matter too. So we have these value systems and these political systems that really impede the governance systems of Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, who reside, whose land it is that Canada's borders surround us with. So those are, everything that's already been commented on. The remoteness of communities. Well, remoteness for communities is that the people prefer to be in certain areas, and they really don't want external outside forces impacting their daily lives. Then we use words like isolation, like we're removed from the political systems within the state that we're residing, or the state that is claiming our homeland. So those are real issues that impact our own ways of knowing, doing, and being, our own governance systems, and our own political systems as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Bridget. Ms. Fairman.
Thanks, Whitney, and nice to see everybody here. And it's great. I love that you're putting where you're from in the chats, because it's really interesting to see who's tuning in and interested. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of comments that were made earlier by Dr. Steppeton around, the idea of stereotypes and how, with real issues of the day, we aren't included, or we use sort of iconic ways to include Indigenous people in the conversation. And I also find that, for example, when I partake in advisory groups, or if I'm asked to contribute, it's usually around how to address stereotypes and systemic racism, from the perspective of, how do we change the way that we approach things so that these stereotypes don't continue to exist. And I find that problematic because although I'm interested in process, I'd really rather be invited to the table to contribute substantively around what the issue is that we're talking about, as opposed to helping everybody else figure out how to be more inclusive. And I think I've heard that also in Dr. Koch's comments, this fatigue that you have around trying to address the issue of continuing stereotypes, as opposed to being asked for your opinion as an Indigenous person around these really substantive issues. And I think, my experience of that has also been that, it's interesting when people meet you and they think, oh, you're not really like other Indigenous people that I've met, rather than let go of the stereotype of, Inuit or First Nations or Métis people. They want to create a special category for you, like, as educated, or as, outspoken, or as like whatever it is that counters the stereotype, rather than expand their view of what Indigenous people are, how they present. They, it's just such a strong reaction to hold on to this sort of stereotypes that have persisted for so long. And I'd really like to challenge people when you meet, Inuit, First Nation, and Métis people who challenge your stereotype, like really internalize that and think about why that is. And I think another thing that I heard in the earlier comments, which I really just want to emphasize from my experience and my perspective, is that what I find in the narrative around the acceptance of languages, cultures, and way of life that have been in existence since the beginning is that because that narrative was disrupted by colonial forces, we, as an Inuit person, I find we're in an all or nothing category. Like in order to express my language and culture and way of life, the only knowledge of that exists in a traditional sense. And so for me to be able to confidently and without fear say that in a modern sense, I am who I am and I carry these things with me and they persist in the way that I present, in modern issues, in modern settings. It's not something that is easily understood. And it creates fear in for me as well, right? Do I look Indigenous enough? Do I sound Indigenous enough? There's a lot of sensitivity around that. And it is, I would rather let go of that fear and be able to move into these spaces confidently and with the sense that my culture and my language exist and they persist through my activities today.
Well, thank you. I mean, what incredible reflections here. I think, again, wonderful to hear from Sapmi, from the Canadian Arctic, Inuit Nunangat, Denendeh, Métis territory. And I think we're already sort of anticipating the next range of questions as well around the roots and origins, but then also who is practicing, who is mobilizing these stereotypes and for what? And I also think it's interesting, the stereotypes, if you will, mobilized by Indigenous leadership in Canada for certain political purposes, and also how that perhaps is also part of this issue of not in a more fulsome or holistic way, encapsulating all the different expressions of indigeneity or ways of knowing, being, learning in these spaces. But before we get to any of that, Dr. Sidorova, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Whitney. So I would like to talk a little bit about the stereotype, like the Soviet and post-Soviet stereotypes of specifically Northern Indigenous peoples first, and then I'm just gonna, and after that, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine context and indigeneity. So there are like three different narratives that emerged when it comes to the discussion of Northern Indigenous people, specifically in the former Soviet Union and Russia. So the first narrative when it comes to stereotypes is about that a lot of Northern Indigenous peoples are portrayed as one ethnic group, and specifically like Chukchi people, and all other ethnic minorities who live in the North are also seen as Chukchi people. Like they speak the same language, they have the same culture, and they're all reindeer herders. So that's like a very old post-Soviet narrative that was specifically forced by the government. And the reason why this particular narrative emerged was just because Chukchi were very resilient in the war with the Russians. So they never gave up. And the Russians were not actually able to colonize the Chukchi lands. And that was basically the revenge that the Russian and the Soviet and the Russian government took after kind of like losing in this military conflict. So the first narrative would be that all Northern Indigenous peoples, like since the Soviet times, are portrayed in the dominant narrative about Northern Indigenous peoples as reindeer herders, as someone who live like up in the north in cold, isolated areas, small numbers, they're losing their languages, and then the only kind of like thing that the Russians can do is just to save them, to educate them how to speak the Russian properly, et cetera, et cetera. So this is like the first narrative. The second narrative is related to kind of, I would say, not only to indigenous peoples in Russia, like, I mean, in the Far East and Siberia, but also to ethnic minorities in Russia in general. So it's more about stereotyping ethnic minorities, including not only indigenous peoples, but also Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, as rural. So, and that actually divides urban populations of indigenous peoples or like ethnic minorities and rural populations of indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities, because it's considered, if you speak Georgian, if you're like a real Georgian, or if you're real like Saha like me, and if you speak your language, you're kind of like, you know, like you're uneducated, you're from rural area, you live in the village, you don't have degree, you don't have education, and it's considered to be funny. So, and that's why like a lot of anecdotes that emerge in the Soviet times about Ukrainians or Sakha or Chukchi people, they consider ethnic minorities, non-Russian minorities, as someone who come from the rural area. And that kind of like, this particular narrative unfortunately divided urban and rural populations, specifically in Sakha Republic, because I was personally told that if I speak Sakha in a school, that means that I'm a redneck, or like that's like something dirty, something related to savages and all these sort of things. And since Russia started entering the global discourse about decolonization and colonialism, I see that there are some tendencies to portray the Soviet Union and the Russians in particular as nice colonizers, because they can say, for example, well, you know, Canada introduced this institution of residential schools, and then we have never done it. And instead we gave autonomy to some of the ethnic regions. Instead, we preserved the language. And we kind of like supported indigenous ethnic minorities to some degree. So that's why we're way nicer. So we're not that bad as, let's say, Anglo-Saxons. But at the same time, they completely ignored the fact that the Russians never negotiated land claims. They took all the resources from indigenous lands. And they like the narrative about indigeneity has never been present in the Russian discourse, because like the majority of the Russian citizens are actually white, so they're Slavic Russians. And similar to Sweden, I think that Russians from Western Russia never talk about indigenous peoples. They don't know much about them. They think that they live somewhere far away in remote areas, and they don't want to even know about them. So they're not even part of the media discourse. They're not present in TV, they're not present in movies, etc. And then shifting to the security discourse, I would like to talk about specifically the war in Ukraine, how indigenous peoples who participate in the war in Ukraine are portrayed. So I would say that the dominant Kremlin discourse portrayed indigenous peoples as savages, and they blamed them in participating in massacres. Specifically, when there was a massacre in Ukraine in Bucha, the Russian military, they said that the people who participated, the soldiers who participated in this particular, in Bucha, in this particular village, were not Slavic Russians, but instead they were indigenous peoples from Siberia. And they said that the reason why the Russian soldiers were so bloodthirsty, because they were not ethnic Russians, they were Buryat people. So they specifically referred to this ethnic nation to say that the Slavic Russians couldn't really do that. But instead, these terrible indigenous peoples went to this village and killed everyone. So they tried to kind of like blame indigenous peoples in this massacre. And the next kind of like narrative that's related to specifically indigeneity and security in the war in Ukraine is that within Russia, some of the indigenous military who participated in the war are portrayed as war heroes. So kind of like it's a discourse of being kind of a part of one nation. So if you're indigenous and you participated in the war, like you're a good person, you're a real Russian, and you're kind of like patriotic. So it's a part of the discussion about patriotism. And then if you kind of like protest the war, if you participate in protests against the war, then you're an ethno-nationalist. So you don't want to defend your country, as they say. And if you go against the government, then you're gonna be portrayed as the foreign agent. So you're someone who are like sponsored by the West. You defend the United States of America, and you go against your country, so anti-patriotic. So that's how kind of like weird way of how Russia nowadays tries to portray itself as a decolonizer, because it tries to kind of like team up with the Middle Eastern countries, with some of the African countries, as anti-Western force that can challenge the dominance of the West and decolonize the world. So that's pretty much it. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Oh, thanks. And I think there's a lot there to bring into this overall dialogue when we're thinking in circumpolar ways, right? I think we're talking about Indigenous peoples not being treated as singular, which I very much hear a lot of you speaking to. And I see a lot of that in media misrepresentations. But that also we're thinking about diversities across the circumpolar world. Contexts are different. And in some cases, I think we've already anticipated my next question for you, which is the roots of these stereotypes. And Kopeli and Jen and others, you've already started speaking about this. I think sort of welcome the group to reflect on where are these coming from? And maybe we've heard some of the origins coming from colonial projects and processes. Do you discern certain emerging narratives or narratives that are being mobilized? And Helene, I think you referred to some of these as well, that relate to what's often described in the media as the opening of the Arctic or the changing Arctic. So are there different forms of Indigenous stereotypes or persistent Indigenous stereotypes being mobilized to serve emerging commercial or political purposes, which might also include tourism? Sorry for that really clumsy question, but hopefully you can see where I'm kind of going with it, of thinking about not only the ones that are already sort of deeply embedded, but you have some thoughts on some of the ones that are emerging or being used in sort of new or unexpected forms. Helene, over to you, please.
Thank you for the question, but I'm going to respond to what everyone else just said in our last round of questions. and feel free, anyone else can jump on that question. But I wanted to say Karasakuk, thank you, Zhenya. There are so many similarities between our Indigenous experiences in Russia and in Alaska. And then just on representation, I noticed this thread throughout all of the conversations, and I wanted to respond to that and the language of loss and language in particular when it comes to traditional and contemporary representations of Indigenous peoples. So I don't think representation is everything, in that I don't think it's radical, but I do think that taking back power in the form of media and representation can address some of these issues with the hegemonic and monolithic portrayals of Indigenous peoples to mainstream society, right? And I wanted to speak to what Dirk mentioned in the beginning, the quote from the Sami person, Asa: representation makes it our job to correct. And that is exhausting. Why should we, Indigenous peoples, right, be spending our time doing that work? This is why I feel these types of ways about representation in particular. Because rather than telling our own stories on our own terms, we're stuck with, dealing with this narrative. And I feel like that's what that question was also making me do, which is why I'm diverting the conversation. It follows the "we're still here" narrative, which I don't think it's enough. Of course, Indigenous peoples, of course, we're still here. It feeds into this idea that, like, well, we used to be like this. We used to look like this. We used to dress like this, right? And this is something that everyone mentioned. But that even isn't a representation of ourselves today, right? Like, I'm wearing a business suit and I'm wearing glasses and I'm on the computer. I'm still Indigenous. The rhetoric of "we're still here" and representation is still built around the idea of loss. So I'm going to speak to loss quickly, briefly. We have so much more to share than our trauma as Indigenous peoples. So much more than our languages are dying, or our languages are dead, or our language loss, right? Or that loss gets to characterize our culture, our ways of living, our places. Loss displaces accountability. So, speaking to that question briefly, colonial and settler governments are responsible for this, quote, loss, right? But we're Indigenous peoples. This also removes our autonomy to make decisions on our own terms about how we are adapting as master adapters, because we've always been here. And colonial and settler governments are responsible for this loss through schools, right? Boarding schools in the United States, residential schools in Canada, through just the lack or misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and our ways of knowing in the Western school system. Because if we look at school systems, schools are designed to create citizens, and settler nations do not want Indigenous peoples to be the citizens, right? The root of settler colonialism is to erase Indigenous peoples. So why on earth would they educate their citizens on who we are? So, and that continues. That's a legacy of settler colonial education systems today in Alaska and Russia, throughout settler nations. But I'm going to move away from this language of loss and into empowerment, right? So Dr. Eve Tuck has this 2009 article called Suspending Damage, and it calls to this, to suspend damage-centered narratives of Indigenous peoples and to share desire-centered stories. And I take that upon myself as an Indigenous person to avoid this trauma porn and poverty porn that everyone is obsessed with Indigenous peoples. And now it's climate porn. It's like, oh God, these poor natives, and they're losing their spaces and they don't have polar bears or walrus. And like, yes, that's a very big part of it, but I don't think that empathy politics are going to change the world, right? Because that appeals to empathy rather than simply giving power back to Indigenous peoples to make decisions on our own terms. We're more than our trauma. And this is one thing that can happen when we get to tell our own stories. It's a refusal to the colonial gaze, which I think a lot of us spoke to. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say for now. I want to make sure there's time for everyone else to respond.
Thanks. I wonder, Kim or Bridget, just to not get into a flow where we're all following the same order, any reflections on either Haliana's intervention just now, or building on some of the other comments that you heard?
Yeah, I would just. Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Kimberly. Sorry.
I think I agree with everything that Dr. Stephenson is saying. And in fact, a lot of the narratives and the rhetoric that exists, the way that in Canada, reconciliation and this movement has also become constraining for Indigenous people is something that we need to talk about more. And so it just upholds, what she said, and also say that has been my experience as well. And hoping to move past, the rhetoric that exists around the trauma and loss piece. Although I think it's important to acknowledge, and there should be accountability. Let's move, to a place of empowerment.
Bridget?
Yeah, I really appreciate the word accountability, and empowerment I struggle with as it's defined, but I think that taking up our power, taking up our responsibility for the protection of our lands and our human rights and our animals is really important for us. The identity politics as well, and I appreciate what Haliana was saying too, is that there's this romanticized picture of who Indigenous peoples are, and then of course we're struggling with this whole everybody wants to be a First Nations, but they certainly don't, or Inuit or Métis, but they certainly don't know our history. And there's this whole pretendians and this whole movement of stolen identities is horrific for us to even try to put a finger on. You mentioned earlier, Whitney, too, that some of these greater concerns, and I think we really have to be concerned with these modern day treaties, also known as land claim agreements. We have to be concerned with self-government agreements. And then, of course, who gets to speak for whom and in what space. So how are certain leaders, if we want to use that term, connected to the political powers of Ottawa, and how important is that narrative to the demise or to the prosperity of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit? And when we talk about identity, it's, for me, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, they should have the autonomy to say, I'm the mother of this child, and this child is, this child is Métis, this child is First Nations. Not the government saying, well, there's going to be a blood quantum, or, you're only Indigenous if your father is Indigenous, or this whole claim narrative as well, that's really impacting who we are as distinct peoples within the state borders. So all of these political dichotomies are really impacting us, but it's not that we haven't been able to make gains and power up and take up the responsibility to start sharing our own narrative. But we also have to be careful with that, as Haliana was saying, is that we don't perpetuate that that narrative that's always about the disadvantages or the marginalization or the erasure. It should also be about, how have we come out of all this Black history, very dark history, but we're still here as a thriving, adaptable, resilient nation, not just as subjects to the state. So I think there's a whole lot to unpack there, Whitney, and but this work we do every day to try to claim up our roles and responsibilities and our own storytelling mechanisms is really important as we move forward with the dismissing of just the empathy and constraints that we're confounded and confronting every day.
Well, thank you very much. And I think even in the way that this conversation was initially framed, I think of how you're wonderfully pulling it in the directions. I think that it forces us to reimagine too the nature of the questions and the assumptions embedded in the ways that we're inviting certain types of conversations. And I think it's very inspirational in what you're saying. Kopeli, I know you were seeking to.
Yeah, just a quick response. Thank you, Haliana, for bringing this this discussion to another path. And I just wanted to add also, when we talk about representation and different stories, often it's looking at what everyone else is saying, and it's because we're talking still about different kind of media. And having done work on digital media, how it's used in Sapmi, I think that's something quite different than when we talk about how other media may perpetuate or maintain or even reinforce some discourses. I think there's a lot of potential in how digital media can be used and actually are used by Indigenous communities. And Sapmi is quite a high level of digital infrastructure and digital literacy, so I know it's different in other Indigenous contexts, but I think it's fascinating to see how we can find other Indigenous spaces where, exactly as you were describing, Haliana, on your own premises, can discuss issues that are important, small or big things, important for community, not having to respond or comment or, in having a discussion that was initiated by the mass media or those behind the mass media. So I just wanted to bring this nuance when we're talking about the media, that there is so many nuances there, and I think the media landscape today gives us also opportunities for finding this spaces, even if everything is not fine with digital media. There's also bringing the dark side of it, but that's just what I wanted to bring in.
Thanks, Dirk.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not going to take up a lot of space here. I just wanted to address the question you asked earlier, Whitney, about emerging stereotypes, and refer to one of the comments in the chat section, which I'm sure you've all seen, by Mikael Lindblad, who is the chairperson of the board of Giron Sami Teatern, and his point that Sami people nowadays also being seen as a hindrance in when it comes to measures to prevent global climate change, or how they're being reduced to being angry activists that stand in the way of economic development. And one important detail here to mention is also that not only is the town of Kiruna-Giron the home of the largest iron ore mine, but they've also recently discovered rare minerals, which of course are very, very precious now that everybody wants, which the EU also celebrated because it will make them independent of China. That's how the reasoning goes. So there's really this emerging stereotype, especially in political discourse, of the Sami people hindering this economic development.
Thank you for that intervention as well, and we certainly see that playing out in Canadian discourse as well. And interesting that some of the public opinion polling, yes, again, definitely a Western, sort of tool, but suggests that there are perhaps some wide points of divergence between what public opinion polling is suggesting are, and this again is the notion of indigenous perspectives, which is undifferentiating between different peoples with different backgrounds, never mind factoring in gender and age and a whole bunch of other intersectional variables that may help to color who is claiming to speak for whom. But I see this as one of the areas where we can also see competition from outside of our societies as well, taking these important conversations that we need to be having, and I say we in a collective sense, scaled up to all the different aspects of our societies. We need to be protecting that we have the democratic space to have these conversations. Also means not having mainstream media categorizing us and telling us what we think, making assumptions based upon stereotypes being imported that are all tethered to certain forms of politics. Definitely space to come back. Our last question was about instruments or steps to address. I think we've already seen talked a little bit about why that may be seen as almost a deficit mindset, and maybe not the conversation we want to have going forward. Maybe it's up to the colonizers and the media to figure out what steps it should take to address these things and be more inclusive. But if you have any final reflections on that, certainly welcomed in terms of instruments. But I think all of you have touched on that to some extent. Jen, I'll turn it over to you. Then we'll see if there's one or two questions from the audience. And then, Andre, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up. Sorry, Jen, over to you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that you said Jen. So I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Haile Hannah that the purpose of colonial educational institutions was not to support indigenous peoples, but to erase indigeneity, because they want citizens. They don't want indigenous peoples. They don't want any indigeneity to be discussed. And in this regard, I see that as the person who was educated in predominantly kind of like white Russian colonial educational institutions, at least during my high school, I see that sometimes when I talk to the Russians, they say, oh, despite your looks, you're a real Russian. And because I think that's in many cases, when people say indigenous, they assume that you need to look like a picture from the museum, like in the traditional attire, and you need to look like fully indigenous and act like an indigenous person. So talking to me kind of like breaks their stereotypes and gives them some sort of a culture shock. And I noticed the same kind of tendency among Canadians as well, when they say, oh, like despite our cultural differences, we're all Canadians. And they don't really understand that by saying that, they're not being friendly or decolonial or like open-minded, but instead they perpetuate the old colonial narratives that the educational institutions want to impose on indigeneities, on indigenous peoples. But at the same time, I see there is a lot of value when it comes to education, when it comes to getting degrees, because by getting the Western education, you learn about the system. You know how white people think, you know how colonizers think, while you're still indigenous and while you're still reconnect with your culture, speak your language, and identify yourself as indigenous. And if you use it as a tool to empower yourself and kind of see both sides, as an indigenous person, as a person who got the same degree as your white colleagues, that kind of gives you an opportunity to argue with white people at the same table. And at the same time, I noticed that when I lived in Calgary and when I lived in Fairbanks, Alaska, it's like kind of expected when you're in the classroom, and if you say, oh, you know, I'm Indigenous Siberian from Yakutsk, Russia, that you're supposed to be quiet and you're supposed not to argue, just to listen and do whatever, you know, like they want from you. It's not like something that could be considered to be intentional, but it's more like, I think it's just expectation. And when you start talking and the way how you talk, if you talk with the confidence, that's something that surprises people just in general. But that's like the purpose. When white people talk to you, and then if they disagree with you, they raise their voices, they try to intimidate you, and you're not getting intimidated, but instead you argue with them as another white person, it kind of gives them a culture shock. And that's the purpose. Just to kind of like give them the reaction so they could think into their heads, what are you? You're not Indigenous, but you're not white. So what are you? So having this particular reaction and kind of understanding the system, I think that's something that could empower Indigenous scholars in particular. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Ariana, I just wanted to turn to you for a second to see if there are any questions that have come in through the question and answer function, or if we're just using chat. Any audience questions? Or actually, I'll open it up then and invite if there's any members of the audience who'd like to use either chat or to indicate that they'd like to pose a question directly to our esteemed panelists. Would welcome you to do so at this time. Yeah, I've really taken a lot out of this conversation in even thinking about the different frames or ideas that are animating our approaches to these. And Kim, I'm really struck by there's a lot I'm going to take back to certainly my circles about making sure that we are actually creating spaces to make sure that people are invited to provide that input onto substantive issues, and this not to be this moment in time where it's really about a lot of settlers, non-Indigenous people asking these big questions about how can we be inclusive without missing all of that expertise, all of those different ways of knowing that are out there that should be more central in actually driving forward the substantive issues that are on the agenda, or even more importantly, setting those very agendas themselves. So I think that's a really powerful message amongst many that have come out of our conversation. Michael, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just want to bring up the question of what I am afraid of is kind of a new narrative about Indigenous people, and the example is the situation in Sweden now, where mainstream media seems to portray the Samis as something as a problem, a new problem, being standing away for the green revolution or whatever, and while getting a free ticket for the Canadian mining companies or from New Zealand or whatever, coming here because it's very liberal, the rules around mining, for instance, in Sweden. So I'm afraid of a new narrative that is as a turning from the romantic idea of the wild people and all the fantastic cultural expressions and so on, to something new that is something is in the way, and I'm in this polarized new situation in the world. I think that is, I'm afraid of that is going to get more and more space even in the main media. So that's my reflection, and I hope it's not true, but I'm a little bit afraid of that. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. Bridget, would you like to offer a final reflection on that, and then we'll turn things back over to the organizers?
Sure. And Michael, I think you went be disappointed by studying the Berger Inquiry. And that happened because the elders asked their younger youth to take up the challenge with the government of the day because of resource extraction and resource greed and exploitation. So and that's the same portrayal of Indigenous peoples within the Northwest Territories as well, that we were in the way, that we were, angry activists, that we were so few that our voices shouldn't matter. So those are some comparisons that may come in to support your concerns. The other thing that all these modern day treaties, new land claims brought about too is this co-management regime. But that co-management is not about inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledge that is going to be defining how work gets done, or co-production. It's all about the rhetoric of from a bureaucratic colonial and a Western process that's still going to overlook Indigenous people's positions and knowledge and their own self-determination efforts. So those are real realities that may support your concern with what's happening in Sami, and the fact that we have to go to the Supreme Court all the time to defend our human rights and to defend our land rights and our environment is really still a scary situation for all Indigenous peoples in the circumpolar world and globally. Back to you, Whitney.
Mm-hmm. Just a comment. It seems like in Norway, the government hasn't followed the rule of the High Court concerning the windmills, as you know, and some journalists who is talking about the Sami as a group of privileged people. She doesn't care about the High Court rules from different. So and that's why I'm concerned when you are not even taking part or understanding what justice, how justice works, even though it's the High Court. So that's a little bit scary, I would say. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And I think this is always great when you end a panel by saying we clearly do not have enough time. We've introduced many issues, and I think there's very, very rich food for thought for all of us. Some really, I think, interesting questions have been posed in chat. I think from our own respective positionalities, we can think about how we can perhaps address some of these questions. But definitely thank you very much to all the panelists. I've certainly learned a lot, I can truly say, from each and every one of you in this discussion, and certainly a lot to take forward as hopefully the first of many conversations on these topics. Andre?
Yes, thank you, Whitney, and thank you all the participants for this insightful discussion and your insightful presentations. I feel that we just opened this topic and we could have another 10 or even 100 webinars on this topic in the future. And thank you, North American and Arctic Defense Security Network, for co-organizing this webinar. And we at the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network, we always invite you to participate in our upcoming webinars, which you can find on our website, shareyournorth.is. And of course, you're always welcome to approach us with your ideas and your topics for future webinars. Guys, you are all awesome and have a great time, and see you on the next webinars.